I set the tea tray down with hands that had stopped trembling years ago. Lavender steam curled up from the cups, delicate, comforting. He didn't notice. Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table, flipping through a folder of neatly printed documents. He wore that careful smile he'd picked up from corporate meetings, polite, calculated. "This is just a formality," he said. "Helps us get pre-approved faster. Just need a signature, that's all." He nudged the folder toward me with the tip of his pen. The pen was already uncapped. I looked down. My name printed in bold. And beneath it, transfer of temporary ownership with power of decision over real property. No mention of a timeline, no clause about my safety, no hint of love. Just legal distance, just leverage. The same house where I had rocked him to sleep through chickenpox. The same windows I had washed before every winter. The same floors where his father collapsed 7 years ago, coffee still warm in his hand. I stirred my tea once. Twice. Didn't drink. He leaned forward slightly. "We'd pay taxes, of course. You'd still live here. Nothing changes." I smiled, soft. Thin. I didn't tell him the truth, that the house had already been in his name for 3 years. That his father made that decision quietly with faith I wasn't ready to question until now. Because there was a clause, buried in the original deed. Effective only if the beneficiary resides on property and provides sole care to the current occupant. He didn't know that part. He never asked. He assumed. That I'd hand over the keys. That I'd make it easy. That love meant obedience. He took another sip of tea. It had gone cold. I placed my hand on the folder and closed it gently. "I'll need time," I said. His smile faded just a hair. And I saw it then. Not my son. But a man looking at a solution, not a mother. Would you have told him the truth or waited like I did? Because some silences aren't fear. They're protection. And some signatures. They don't just transfer property. They surrender something deeper. Would you sign it? Or protect what's already yours? Where are you listening from? Has anyone ever tried to take something you didn't know you already gave? The morning light in Vermont is a quiet kind of gold. It doesn't shout through the windows. It lingers soft, steady, the way my husband used to read the paper. I still keep his mug on the windowsill. A faded blue one with a chip on the rim. He never wanted a new one. Said it fit his hand like old truths. 7 years since he passed. 7 winters of snow brushing the cedar porch. 7 springs of me planting lavender in the same 3 clay pots. I water them every Thursday. He always said they smelled like peace. The house hasn't changed much. I dust the picture frames once a week. Polish the wooden banister, even though no one slides down it anymore. And I still put 2 slices of toast in the oven each morning. Habit is its own kind of company. Daniel calls once a week. Mostly on Sundays. Short calls. "How's the weather up there?" "Still baking that banana bread," Lauren says hi. He doesn't ask if I'm lonely. Doesn't ask if the pipe's grown louder now when the wind shifts. But I answer like everything's fine. Because that's what mothers do. Lauren hasn't called me in months. Not since Christmas when I gave her a hand-stitched throw blanket and she said, "Oh, I think we have one kind of like this already." She didn't mean to be cruel, but cruelty doesn't always wear sharp teeth. Sometimes it smiles politely and folds the blanket away before you've even sat down. The first mention of help came on a Tuesday. Daniel's email came at 6:04 p.m. Subject line: quick question. "Hey Mom, hope you're doing okay. Lauren and I are working on some refinance stuff for the condo. We might need to show some asset support like co-ownership or future inheritance stuff. Nothing major, just paperwork. Can I give you a call? No, love you. No, take your time, just paperwork." That night I stared at the ceiling for hours. The fan made its slow rotations above me, humming like the sound of something winding down. I hadn't told him. About the deed. About what Mark had done before he died. It was the fall of 2020. The world was strange and uncertain. But Mark was calm, methodical. He had started organizing the files in his study. Asked me to sit beside him one afternoon, handed me a folder marked house, Transfer. I want Daniel to have it one day, he said. Not just the house. The weight of caring for you, if he chooses. If I asked. Mark just nodded. He'll show us who he is when it matters. He died 3 months later. I never opened the folder again. Until now. The next time Daniel called, his tone was sweet. Too sweet. We've been crunching numbers, he said. It'd just be a temporary transfer. You'd still live there, obviously. Obviously. He went on about loan-to-value ratios, pre-approval letters, just a signature. I stood in the kitchen with the phone pressed between my ear and shoulder, wiping down the counter that was already clean. It's really just for ease, Mom, he said. And you'll be protected, of course. I didn't say no. I said I'd think about it. And when we hung up, I stood for a long time with the dish towel in my hands, folded and unfolded it 5 times. That weekend, I walked to the small hardware store downtown. I bought a new key box. Not because I needed one, but because I didn't want to forget where I kept mine. There's something about feeling replaced that doesn't come loud. It creeps in through polite suggestions and shared Google Docs. It settles in your stomach and whispers you don't get to decide anymore. A week later, Lauren emailed me directly. Hi Helen, just wanted to touch base on Daniel's note. We totally understand if you have questions, happy to help figure out what works best for all of us. Hope the lavender's blooming. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't help, it was strategy, packaged in pleasantries, laced with entitlement. I didn't reply. Instead, I went down to the basement. The stairs creaked the way they always had. 3 steps in, the second one dips just slightly to the left. Mark always meant to fix it. I crouched by the old paint shelf, pulled out the file box behind it. Inside were folders he labeled in neat black pen. Helen's health. Life insurance. Deed. I pulled out the deed. My hands didn't shake, but my breath did. There it was. Clear as anything. Ownership transferred to Daniel McCarthy. Effective the 1st of October 2020. And underneath the clause, Mark had added transfer valid only under condition that occupant is provided full care and co-residency by the beneficiary. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd held. He hadn't given it to Daniel, he'd given it to me on trust. Trust that Daniel would choose right. And now I placed the folder in my lap, held it like a question. The first time Lauren visited again, she brought lemon bars. Store-bought. Still cold from the plastic container. She placed them on my kitchen counter like a peace offering, but there was no war, at least not one I had declared. She wore perfume I didn't recognize. Sweet powdery. Too much for a Sunday afternoon. Daniel followed behind her, smiling like this was just another weekend drop by. I told Lauren you've been working on the garden beds, he said. She thought you might want help. I hadn't asked for help, but I nodded anyway. I've learned over time it's easier to make space for people when they've already let themselves in. We sat in the sunroom, the 3 of us, the lemon bars untouched. Lauren folded her hands neatly in her lap, legs crossed like she was waiting to be invited into a conversation she had already planned to lead. So she said brightly, "We've looked into a few things, and I think we've found a route that makes the most sense. It's honestly win-win." Daniel looked down at his phone. Didn't speak. Didn't stop her either. "It's just a temporary shift in title," she continued. "A legal placeholder. The equity stays in the family. You stay here. It's not about ownership, it's about opportunity." I stared at the smudge on the window pane behind her, just above the lavender pot. I'd meant to clean it that morning but forgot. Lauren smiled. "You'd still have full access, of course. But we'd handle the details, make sure nothing falls through the cracks." Her voice had a rhythm, smooth, assured. She'd practiced this. "I see," I said. Daniel finally spoke. "Mom, we just want to get things in order. It's better for everyone." He used the word everyone like it included me. I looked at his hands. They were resting on his knees, open, calm. The same way Mark used to rest his hands when he was trying not to push too hard. "I'll think about it," I said. Lauren reached over, touched my arm. Lightly. "Of course. No pressure. But timing matters with these things. She said it like a friend. Like someone who believed her suggestion was generosity. After they left, I stared at the lemon bars. The expiration date printed on the label was smudged. Like the gesture itself vague, well-intended but hard to swallow. That evening, I opened Mark's folder again. Not to reread it. Just to feel the weight of it in my hands. It grounded me in something that hadn't changed. Daniel texted the next day. "Hey Mom. Just checking in. Did you talk to anyone yet? We're happy to help set it all up." No question mark. Just a gentle nudge dressed in punctuation. I didn't reply. Not yet. That Friday I visited Mrs. Backer, our former neighbor. She used to work as a paralegal. Now she mostly bakes sourdough and feeds the birds. "I just have a general question," I said, sipping the tea she offered in a cracked mug with daisies. She listened. Didn't interrupt. When I finished, she sat back, arms folded. "Well," she said. "That doesn't sound like help. That sounds like transfer of power." Her words landed sharp. Not dramatic. Just true. "If they're rushing you," she said, "it's not for your benefit." The next morning Daniel called again. "Mom, can we just get this moving? Lauren found a financial advisor who said we're wasting time. Rates are climbing. We're trying to be smart." Smart. That's what I taught him to be. He was a boy who color-coded his school folders, who corrected grammar on cereal boxes. Mark used to joke he'd grow up to manage someone else's fortune. He was never greedy. But he liked control. "Let's set a time to talk again," I said. My voice calm, measured. "Next week." "Here." He paused. Just for a second. Then said, "Okay." When they returned, Lauren brought a folder. Inside, a draft agreement. Printed, indexed, highlighted. "Just a placeholder," she said again. Her voice brighter than before. Too bright for someone who wasn't hiding anything. This time I offered tea. Just 1 cup. For myself. Daniel flipped to the signature page. Held out the pen. "Mom. This is the smart thing to do." I met his eyes. "Do you trust me?" he asked. That was the moment something snapped, not out loud, but inside. Not because he asked, but because he didn't realize the question was backward. "I trust who you were," I said softly. The boy who once cried when he thought he lost my birthday card. He blinked. Lauren cleared her throat. "You'll have full occupancy rights, of course." "Of course," I echoed. But I didn't reach for the pen. I reached for the folder beneath my chair. Their smiles faltered. Inside was a printout of Mark's deed. His clause. His condition. I didn't hand it over, not yet. I simply placed it on the table. Face down. They didn't touch it. Didn't ask. Daniel looked at me, expression unreadable. Then he said, "So we're doing this the hard way." I smiled. "Hard for who? Would you sign just to keep the peace? Or would you wait and draw your line?" The letter came on a Wednesday. Not from Daniel, not from Lauren. From a bank I didn't recognize. It was addressed formally to Miss Helen McCarthy, but the tone felt oddly familiar. "This is a courtesy follow-up regarding preliminary asset verification tied to the co-owned property at 614 Forest Lane. My address. My home. But co-owned," I read it again. Then a third time. They had listed Daniel as a pending joint applicant. Underneath, in small print, documentation pending on title authorization. I folded the letter, placed it face down on the kitchen counter. The granite felt colder than usual under my palms. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text Lauren. I made a cup of tea instead. Poured it into the blue mug with the chip. The one that used to be Mark's. Then I walked to the front porch and sat in the wicker chair, the one with the uneven leg that creaks when I shift. The air was sharp for April. Still held onto the tail end of winter like a grudge. A pickup truck rolled by. The mailman waved. Life somehow continued with perfect ignorance. That afternoon I called Carol. Carol Davis. Mark's old estate lawyer. She'd retired a few years back, but I remembered her voice, clipped, precise, never cruel. "Carol," I said when she picked up. A pause. Helen McCarthy, I nodded even though she couldn't see me. Yes. Well, she said slowly, what can I do for you after all this time? We met at her home the next morning. She served coffee with heavy cream and no sugar. Books lined the walls. Legal ones. Fiction. A few gardening manuals. I handed her the folder. Mark's folder. The deed, the clause, the trust that hadn't been touched since the day he passed. Carol flipped through it in silence. Then she looked up. You haven't told them this exists number, and they've been pressuring you for control of the property. Yes. She nodded, her lips pressed tight. The clause is valid, the original filing still stands. They can't legally act without your participation. I exhaled slowly. But they can apply pressure, she added. Make you feel like this is your only path. Especially if they think you're isolated. That word stuck with me on the drive home. Isolated. It's not the same as being alone. Being alone is quiet. Peaceful sometimes. Isolation is something others do to you. Step by step. Smile by smile. Later that evening, Daniel showed up unannounced. I was folding laundry, kitchen towels mostly. He walked in without knocking. Still had a key. I never asked for it back. Mom, he said, voice light, too light. We need to talk. I motioned toward the kettle. It's not boiled yet. I'm not here for tea, he said, placing a new folder on the table. I talked to someone at the bank, he added. They said you might be unsure about signing because of legal complications. He said it with air quotes, as if the law were a suggestion. Then he looked me squarely in the eye. We're not trying to cut you out. You know that, right? Do I asked, quietly. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. That gesture again. He used to do that before math tests. This isn't personal, he said. It's planning. Lauren and I were thinking long-term, for all of us. He paused. But if we wait too long, you could lose refinancing benefits. If something happens to you and this isn't in order, it gets complicated. Expensive. That word again. If something happens to you. I looked at him. Not the boy I raised, but the man in front of me weighing risk against relationship. You already applied for joint ownership, I said flatly. His mouth tightened. That's just paperwork. It's not filed. Yet. You didn't think to ask me first. I thought you trusted me, he said. And in that moment his voice cracked, not with guilt, but with disbelief. Like he couldn't fathom that I might say no. After he left, I stood in the doorway for a long time. The sun had begun to set, brushing the treetops with orange. A squirrel darted across the yard. I walked back inside and locked the door. Then, for the first time in months, I locked the side door too. That night I pulled out my wedding album. Not out of nostalgia, but because I needed to remember who I was before I became someone's mother. Mark looked young. Too young to know the kind of foresight he ended up having. There was a note tucked into the back of the album, his handwriting small, steady. If Daniel ever forgets who he is, you don't have to. You get to protect what I left for you, and what I left in you. The next morning I called Carol again. Her voice was steady. So, she said, are we ready to move? I didn't hesitate. Yes. Would you confront them now, or would you quietly build the wall before they notice? The email came the morning I was meant to meet Carol again. Subject line, transition plans, just thinking ahead. It was from Lauren. Hi Helen, Daniel and I were talking last night, and we realized maybe this is all just too much paperwork. What if we simplify everything? We'd love to have you come live with us. We've already cleared the guest room. That way no documents needed. No stress. You'll be cared for. We'll be right there. She ended it with a smiley face. The kind people use when they're pretending it's a gift, not a decision. I sat at the kitchen table rereading it. The smell of over-toasted bread clung to the air. I'd forgotten it in the oven. Move in with them, leave this house. My garden. My mornings with the chipped mug and the paper and the hum of birds behind the pine. They didn't ask if I wanted to. They only said we'd love. That afternoon Daniel called. I know Lauren reached out, he said casually. I just think, Maybe it's time we stopped putting so much pressure on you. Pressure. The irony almost made me laugh. But I didn't. He continued. You shouldn't be up there alone, Mom. What if something happens? A pause. What if you fall or forget something on the stove? I said. Yet he answered. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt smaller somehow, not in size, but in certainty. Like something sacred had been touched without permission. I opened the drawer beside my bed and found the old birthday card from Mark. The last one he ever gave me. Inside, he had written, You are the most self-sufficient person I know. But even strong people deserve to be protected. Protect yourself however you need to. Love always. I held the card against my chest, closed my eyes, and I cried. For the first time in a long while. Not because I was afraid, but because something in me was being grieved. At Carol's the next morning, I handed over the updated trust papers she had prepared. We sat at her kitchen table, two women in their 60s, one with a legal background, the other with a slowly breaking heart. You're sure? She asked. I nodded. Yes. Once this is filed, she said, you have full legal reign. No one touches the house, not even Daniel. Not even if he already thinks he owns it. He doesn't know he doesn't, I said. Carol looked at me with something between admiration and sadness. Then you're protecting him too. I shook my head. I'm protecting the version of him I still hope lives inside. We filed everything by noon. The house, though technically already his, was now folded into a private revocable trust. Control restored. Quietly. Legally. Without confrontation. When I got home, the lavender pots were still damp from yesterday's rain. The wind had knocked over the smaller one. I set it upright again. Some roots had shown. I covered them with dirt, firm, gentle, final. The next evening, Daniel and Lauren arrived. They didn't call first. Lauren carried a small catalog in her hand, Senior Living Communities. Daniel had a binder. We just want to talk, he said. But their voices said otherwise. Lauren spoke first. There's this place in Lexington. It's lovely. Small, quiet. Safe. They do gardening classes and even lavender soaps. I blinked. Daniel added, it's close to us. You'd see us weekly, more even. I don't want to leave my home, I said. There was a pause. Mom, Daniel said softly, it's not really your home anymore. And there it was. The moment the air left the room. The moment the story changed. He didn't mean to say it. Not like that. But it came out because it was already true in his mind. Not my home. Just the house I happened to live in. I stood. My hands on the back of the chair for balance. I think you should go now, I said. Daniel's eyes searched my face. Not for understanding. For leverage. Lauren placed the catalog on the table like an offering. Then followed him out. I sat in the same spot for another hour. Catalog still there. Its glossy cover showing a woman smiling in a community garden. Not a wrinkle out of place. Not a single root exposed. Would you have said something different? Would you have begged to stay? Or would you have done what I did? And let silence answer for you. The next Sunday, the church bulletin had a small note about me. Nothing direct. Just a line during announcements. Let's all keep Miss Helen in our prayers as she enters a season of discernment and care. Discernment and care. I hadn't told anyone I was sick, because I wasn't. But someone had told the church otherwise. After the service, Martha Sanders from the women's group came over and took both my hands. Heard you might be moving in with Daniel and Lauren soon. What a blessing to have family who wants you close. I smiled the way I've learned to smile when truth isn't welcome in the room. Tight, soft, empty. That afternoon, I drove home without the radio. The silence felt cleaner than voices I didn't trust. At home, I pulled out a legal pad from the drawer near the fridge. The one where I used to keep grocery lists and holiday cards. This time, I made a different list, things that are still mine. The ceramic owl on the garden bed. Mark's cufflinks in the back of the sock drawer. The recipe for apple crumble that Daniel never quite got right. The key to the safe. My middle name, which Lauren never remembers. Me vote. My voice. I underlined that last one twice. That evening, I called the bank, not Daniel's bank but mine. I asked to verify all listed account holders. Every checking, savings, and investment file. The woman on the line was polite, professional. She read through each record carefully. Everything was still in my name. No secondary names had been added. Yet. Then she paused. There was an access attempt last month on your investment login. Denied, wrong security answers. I wrote that down too. Dated it, filed it. Not in anger. In preparedness. The next morning I walked into town and stopped by the public library. The same library where I once brought Daniel to read about dinosaurs. Now it held something else for me. A printer. And a witness. Margaret, the assistant librarian, was the daughter of my old friend. She watched silently as I printed a notarized copy of my new trust. She asked no questions. Just offered a to-go mug of chamomile on my way out. Back home, I opened the attic door. Inside, I found the old photo albums. Not the curated ones. The real ones. Pictures of me at 27 holding a paintbrush and standing next to Mark in front of this house. Daniel at 4 frowning at his first snowman. Me alone on the porch with a cup of coffee and a notebook in hand. I tore out 3 photos. Slipped them into a manila envelope. Wrote on the front, "This is who I've been. This is what I'm keeping." That week Daniel's tone changed again. His texts became sweeter. His calls more frequent. "Just checking in, Mom. Hope you're feeling strong today. Lauren says we should plan a spa weekend, just us girls. Just us girls." The same Lauren who had just sent my name to a financial planner. I began to keep a journal. Nothing dramatic. Just a record of things said and unsaid. The 12th of April, Daniel used legacy 4 times in one conversation. The 14th of April, Lauren asked if I wanted to be freed of the burden of bills. The 15th of April, a neighbor said Daniel dropped off muffins for the sweet old lady on the hill. Sweet, old lady. They were building a story. One where I was the fragile character they could save. But I was building something too. Only mine had a spine. One Thursday afternoon, I drove to a small attorney's office in the next town. Carol had recommended them, discreet, experienced with elder protection. I didn't bring Daniel's papers. I brought my own. Medical directives. Durable power of attorney with 2 doctors required to confirm incapacity. Asset lock clauses. Privacy limitations. The lawyer reviewed everything with slow, careful eyes. "You're not just protecting money," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm protecting memory, dignity, space." That night, a car idled at the bottom of my driveway for a full minute before turning off its headlights and rolling away. I didn't recognize the vehicle. Didn't have to. I locked every door. Turned off the porch light. Slept with the legal folder beside my bed. The next day, Lauren called. "I wanted to apologize," she said, "for being pushy. I think maybe I misunderstood the depth of your connection to the house." She said connection like it was sentimental. Not legal. Not living. "I appreciate that," I said. She paused. "I know this hasn't been easy. But we just want you safe. And we're hoping you'll come around. Soon. Soon." They were running out of patience. But I had just begun to gather mine. Would you wait for the next move, or would you prepare quietly completely before they ever realized you were steps ahead? The text arrived late on a Monday, just as I was washing the last plate from dinner. Dinner Thursday, just us. No pressure, no papers. Promise. No punctuation at the end. Just that last word hanging there like a hand raised in mock surrender. Promise. Daniel had always known how to sound casual, how to lower a wall while laying a trap. I stood at the sink a while longer, water still running. The light over the stove buzzed softly, flickering like it couldn't decide whether to go out or hold on. I dried my hands slowly, folded the towel, and typed one word back, sure. Then I placed the phone face down on the counter and stared at nothing for several long seconds. Carol picked me up a few blocks away from his house. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She just reached across the center console and touched my wrist lightly. "If you're calm, I'll be calm," she said. "I'm already calm," I replied, which was mostly true. My purse was heavier that evening, not because of anything material, but because of what it now held. A fully executed trust agreement, notarized, filed. A medical directive that gave no room for assumptions. A letter I had written not to Daniel, but to myself. I had tucked that one in the back pocket. Not to read, just to know it was there. Daniel's front yard was freshly mowed. Solar lights lit the walkway. 2 ceramic planters flanked the steps, one chipped at the bottom. I smiled. Mark would have noticed that. He opened the door before I rang the bell. "Hey, Mom." Warm voice. Bare feet. Familiar rhythm. Inside the house smelled like garlic and rosemary, like he'd Googled comfort dinner. A bottle of wine was already breathing. The table was set: white plates, silver chargers, cloth napkins folded with intention. Everything was just right. Too right. "Sit wherever you like," he said, gesturing to the 2 chairs across from each other. We started slow. He asked about my garden, the neighbor's new puppy, whether I'd seen the changes they'd made to the old high school. Small talk with barbed edges. Then, as if he'd suddenly remembered, he stood and walked to the console table. He returned with a folder, sleeker this time. Cream-colored with a gold clip. "I know what you're thinking," he said, already sliding it toward me. No pressure, just an idea. A backup plan. He always made things sound like favors. He sat folding his hands over his lap. "Lauren found someone who said we could do a hybrid setup. Shared authority. Emergency only power of attorney. Just in case anything ever." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I looked at the folder but didn't touch it. Instead, I reached slowly into my purse, pulled out an envelope, and laid it gently, precisely on top of his. Daniel's brow furrowed. His smile wavered. "What's that?" I didn't answer. He opened it. The room shifted. Not in temperature. In tone. He read page 1. Flipped to page 2. His fingers stiffened. His eyes didn't meet mine for a full minute. "You filed this, yes. You created a trust." I did. His jaw tensed. The way it used to when he was told no as a boy and didn't understand why. He looked up at me, not with confusion, but calculation. "Why?" "Because it was mine to do." He blinked, twice. "You think I'd hurt you, no," I said softly. "I think you've forgotten I'm not something to manage." The silence that followed was long. He glanced toward the wine bottle. Then to the untouched bread. "You didn't have to bring Carol. You didn't have to bring papers." He sat back. Still quiet. Then, like a last effort, he said, "We were just trying to make things easier." For whom? He didn't answer that. I stood slowly, smoothing my sweater where it wrinkled at the waist. There was a flicker of something in his expression. Surprise, maybe. Or fear. Or realization. "I'm not moving in with you," I said. Not a threat, just a fact. He exhaled. A quick, shallow breath. "I was trying to take care of things," he mumbled. I leaned forward slightly, voice low. "I already did." Carol appeared then, like timing wasn't just legal but instinctual. She knocked lightly on the frame and stepped inside. She smiled at Daniel as if he were any other person in any other room. "I think we're done here," she said gently. Daniel didn't move. Carol turned to me. "Ready when you are." I nodded. We walked to the door. He didn't follow. He didn't speak. Outside, the wind had picked up. Dry leaves scraped across the sidewalk like they were running out of time. Carol opened the car door for me and paused. Not many women your age walk away before the damage is done. I looked at the house one more time, then turned back to her. "I didn't walk away," I said. "I walked out on my own terms." That night, I didn't change out of my clothes right away. I made tea. Set my phone to silent. Saturday at the kitchen table while the house settled into stillness around me. Not loneliness. Not fear. Stillness. I opened the letter I had written to myself days earlier. It was only a few lines. You do not owe anyone your peace to keep them comfortable. You are not less because you are alone. You are not cruel for protecting what you've earned. I folded it again. Placed it in the drawer with the recipes. Right where legacy belongs. Would you have handed them the truth earlier, or would you have waited until it could no longer be twisted? The first message came the next morning. You made this harder than it had to be. No greeting, no mom. Just that one line, like a verdict handed down by someone who believed I'd been the one holding the gavel. I didn't respond. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I flipped the phone over and let the room go still again. The tea on the counter had gone cold. The toast was untouched. Even the birds outside seemed to hesitate before landing on the feeder. It was as if everything around me was waiting to see if I'd answer. If I'd cave. But I didn't. 2 days later, I found another message, this time from Lauren. Hi Helen, I'm sorry things feel tense. We were just trying to make things easier. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. And then a line that stayed with me far longer than it should have. You raised a strong son. We just wanted to support his future. I read that line twice, then a third time. Polite, polished. But under it, a quiet accusation. You had your turn. Now step aside. I didn't reply. That evening I poured the orange juice down the sink. Not because I was angry, but because it had lost its chill. And I didn't want to drink anything lukewarm ever again. I lit one lamp in the corner of the living room. Let the rest of the house stay dark. I wasn't hiding. I was preserving. Sometimes light should be earned. In the following week the phone didn't ring. No texts, no emails, no doorstep appearances. But something had shifted in the house. The air itself had grown sharper. Not colder, just clearer. Like the silence had become a verdict. Not from me, but from them. I moved slower around the house. Not from age, from intention. Each drawer I opened, I knew exactly what I was looking for. Every photo I touched, I chose whether to keep it or burn it in my mind. One night I went through the messages on my landline. Not to check. Just to listen. Daniel's voice played back from a week ago. The tone was smooth. Practiced. I just wanted to make sure things were handled properly. I miss the way things used to be. I hope we can talk again. Just talk. I didn't delete it. Didn't save it either. I let it sit there between digital dust and emotional obligation. Later that night, I scrolled through old texts. Photos from years back. Daniel grilling in the backyard. Lauren holding a pie I helped her bake. A blurry picture of the dog they adopted before she got too old to climb the stairs. And then farther back texts from when Daniel still ended his messages with "love you." When he used exclamation points too often, I clicked one open. Just looked at it. Didn't try to feel anything. Just noticed what had once been. Then I started deleting them. One by one. Not in anger. In acknowledgement. The last one I kept was a video. Daniel at 10 holding a flashlight under his chin telling a ghost story in the dark. My laugh echoing in the background. I watched it twice, then closed the phone. Placed it upside down. Didn't touch it again that night. I went to bed early, not to sleep. To lie still. The bed felt larger. Not emptier. Just more honest. I had given that boy everything. And the man he became had used it like proof that I owed him more. That was the hardest part. Not the paperwork. Not the pressure. But realizing that what I gave from love he repurposed into leverage. Somewhere along the way I had stopped being a mother in his eyes. And become a resource. And that was a grief no one warns you about. A grief that sounds like your own voice in a voicemail, saying nothing back. At the end of February, I moved. Not far, still near the lake. But deeper into the street where the houses had smaller porches and crooked mailboxes. I didn't take much, just what mattered. Mark's photo. My recipe cards. A chipped blue kettle. and the ceramic owl from the garden. The one that never scared a single bird. Most mornings I walked to the library on Main Street. Not for books, but for the sound of pages being turned near me. I picked up a few shifts at the front desk. Nothing official. Just enough to keep my hands from reaching for things that no longer reached back. That's where I met them. The women who came in quietly. One by one. Every week. They didn't ask questions. They didn't offer advice. They just stayed. Helen, who made quilts from her husband's shirts. June, who always carried peppermint tea in a thermos with her late sister's initials. And Margot, who walked with a cane but never used it until she reached the door. We didn't become friends. Not at first. But we began to sit in the same corners. Reach for the same shelves. One afternoon, Margot asked if I needed help planting the bed behind the building. I said yes. Before I even looked at the soil, we worked in silence. Knees in the dirt. Hands stained. No talk of children. No stories of what we'd lost. Just a rhythm. Like something blooming that had nothing to do with flowers. It was a Saturday morning when I saw him again. I was sweeping the porch of the new place. The sun had pushed through clouds for the first time in days. A car idled at the curb. Not a rental, not a delivery. Daniel. He got out slowly, no folder. No pen. Just an envelope in his hand. He didn't come to the door, just sat on the steps like he used to when waiting for dinner. I stood in the doorway. Watched him for a while. Then walked down and sat beside him. Not close, not far. He said he was sorry. That he'd been overwhelmed. That he had let fear speak louder than love. He looked down at the envelope. Held it out. I didn't take it. Not yet. He said he didn't expect anything. He just wanted me to know he saw it now, what it had cost. I nodded. Told him I forgave him. But I also told him forgiveness doesn't come with a key. Some doors once closed need time. If they open again at all. He nodded. Didn't argue. Just nodded. Then he stood. Placed the envelope beside me on the step, and walked back to his car. I didn't call after him. Didn't wave. I just breathed. Because sometimes the first step back is knowing how to sit still without being pulled under. The first snow came early this year. Not heavy, just a soft dusting, the kind that settles on rooftops like it's asking permission to stay. I watched it from the kitchen window with the mug in my hand, steam curling upward like a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. No music, no news. Just the hush of morning and the sound of the house breathing with me. I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. Like the space around me had grown into the shape of my choosing. The new house isn't big. One floor, a porch that creaks when I lean too hard to the left. A crooked mailbox that I've decided not to fix. It stands like I do now, imperfect, visible, and still here. I brought only what I needed. The chipped kettle. The worn photo of Mark on the bookshelf. My lavender soap. The envelope Daniel left behind. I haven't opened it, not because I'm afraid, but because not every closure needs a conclusion. Some just need stillness. Most mornings I walk to the library before 9. It's not far. The sidewalk cracks guide me like old friends. Margot usually arrives first. She brings a thermos of mint tea and doesn't speak unless spoken to. June started a seed exchange box. She labeled everything in cursive. Sage, basil, wildflower mix. Helen, the older one, still mends quilts behind the reference desk. We don't talk about what we've lost anymore. We talk about what we're planting. We call the little patch behind the building the quiet corner. There's no plaque, no claim. But when the sun hits the soil just right, it feels like a place where women can grow again without explanation. One afternoon I stayed past closing. The others had gone. I remained in the back reshelving large print mysteries with slow care. When I turned the corner, I saw a young woman, early 30s maybe. She stood at the community bulletin board, arms crossed, face pinched. She wasn't reading. She was staring. Like she wanted to post something but didn't know how. I didn't say anything, but as I passed her, I placed a scrap of paper in the tray beside the board. 4 words written in my neatest handwriting: "You don't owe silence." She looked up. Our eyes met for only a moment, but that was enough. At home that evening, I made soup. Onions, carrots, thyme. The smell filled the house the way music used to. Not loud, just steady. I poured a glass of water. Lit one lamp. Saturday at the table with a blank notepad. Not a list. Not a journal. Just a place for thoughts that weren't trying to fix anything. Sometimes healing isn't about action, it's about permission. I wrote one sentence: "My story did not end when there's changed," and then I closed the notebook and tucked it back into the drawer with my recipe cards. Legacy: I've learned lives in the quiet things. The things no one else sees but you carry anyway. Daniel hasn't called again, and I haven't waited. Lauren sent a holiday card, glossy, pre-printed. A small "We hope you're well" scrawled at the bottom in rushed pen. I pinned it behind the pantry door. Not out of malice, but because not everything needs to be seen to be remembered. A few weeks ago, a neighbor stopped me outside the library. "You're Helen, right? The one with the lavender porch," I smiled. "I am." She nodded. "You seem like someone who knows how to be steady." I don't remember what I said in return, but I remember the way she said steady. Like it was something rare. Something earned. I've started keeping one chair at the kitchen table always empty. Not because I'm expecting someone, but because it reminds me that I have space. Space I decide how to fill. Or not. Last Sunday, the snow fell heavier. I lit a fire, made tea. Saturday on the couch with a quilt Margot had gifted me sewn with leftover scraps from women I never met. It felt warm in a way store-bought blankets never do. Like it carried stories I didn't have to hear to believe. I don't know what Daniel tells people. Maybe that I got old. Stubborn, unreasonable. Maybe that's easier than admitting I said no and meant it. But I've stopped wondering how I'm being written into someone else's version of things, because for the first time in a long time, I'm the one holding the pen. Would you have stayed silent, or would you have drawn your own line? Have you ever rebuilt quietly without needing to prove anything? Tell me where you're listening from: your town, your garden, your chair by the window. You're not invisible here. Subscribe to Ian Reddit Story for more real stories of justice, closure, and empowerment after 40. Your voice matters. Your story isn't over. And you are not alone.